stop. In order to be able to store that data, there was no incentivization model for those history nodes to be able to provide that. So what we saw as one of the downsides is that a lot of those that were providing that data up until there, or that storing that data up until there, had to stop. And so the amount of nodes that were storing all of the history nodes essentially went down significantly. And for a period of time, we only had maybe 5 or 6 actual full history node providers that were doing so as a public service. And so we needed to build around that. And so we re-engineered, we re-architectured how that data was being processed, what was being stored, how it was being stored. So we're really pushing the limits at that point, not even of what blockchain could handle, but how typically even machine and data enterprise centers were able to handle in the blockchain space. And so it's quite tricky. So it was one of that double-edged sword, whereby do you allow all of those transactions, and in the community at that time was starting to have very real conversations about, do you, what do you store? Do you essentially end up storing everything because there's a cost? Do you end up not storing everything? But if you go the route of not storing everything, then do you lose some of that immutability? Do you lose? And ultimately what that ended up being, for us anyways, it's called CPU mining essentially. Yeah. That ended up being kind of the base layer foundation for what we see now as GameFi. A lot of the games now that are trending on that radar in the top 10 are CPU mining in DPoS chains. And so we still have a few of the chains that run on the software that we manage and that we maintain, that we develop, are still processing 25, 30 million transactions per day. But we, 2 years ago, re-architectured everything in order to be able to handle that. But then that came with some design decisions, some choices, as you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so one of the design decisions that, for example, Solana makes very differently is the weak subjectivity chain. The accounts database is updated on a per block, well, as an as-needed basis per block. So it actually, the nodes don't have to carry the full history of the ledger with them, right? That's another great example of that's a design trade-off that was made on the Solana network to support it, not having to have that 30, 60, 90 terabyte SSD bolted onto the thing.
Well, another one of those design decisions as well is RAM. So what we're facing in EOS is actually RAM limitations that are not even theoretical. They're at the point where Intel and AMD don't make architecture that can handle the amount of RAM that we need in the hardware that we run the chains on in order to be able to support that large amount of account creation, essentially. So RAM limitations right now are one of the challenges that we're facing, because the amount of, again, going back to GameFi, which Antelope, the EOS.io, the underlying software was rebranded to Antelope about a month and a half ago. That underlying software is run by multiple chains that are running a lot of GameFi. And what we saw in the last cycle is that you have tremendous amount of users coming in. So we're talking about tens and tens of millions of accounts being created in a very short period of time. All that being stored in RAM in order to be able to access in a very rapid way, and we're hitting the bounds of what current computational architecture can provide us, and then we have a trade-off. So do we keep using latest generation hardware more on the desktop level type of computing for the BP nodes, or do we go enterprise grade? If you go enterprise grade, you got a lower clock core speed. Sure, you've got multi-threading, which effectively everything is pretty much single-threaded anyways, and so you're not really using those cores, so that's the trade-off there. But you can have more RAM, or you go on the fast core clock speeds, you still are able to meet that high throughput, but now you're maybe pushing the limits of how many accounts you can actually create. And so that's what we're trying to solve for now, horizontal scaling in that sense.
I think this has been cast also as today on this panel in terms of kind of technical decisions and technical trade-offs. There's also business trade-offs that you make all the time and that drive the technical trade-offs. So for example, we just released an upgrade, now we do 6,000 transactions per second, right? But the head of product at the Algorand technology company says, they have a roadmap that they theoretically know how to get to 10,000 transactions per second and then to 40,000 transactions per second. But they turn to the foundation and say, okay, well, where's the throughput though, right? You get to the point where we need to react to what you're kind of, what kind of activity you're driving on chain. And I think you have a similar kind of situation you do with Aptos, and you I hesitate to say this, but our two chains maybe do, which is that you guys are, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but you're much more, you put things out there that might not be fully baked, and the community loves it, and you're super transparent about it. Hey, we're trying this, it might not be, it's in GitHub, like, what do you guys think? And we are, we kind of make sure it's like right before and I don't know, what is that, and it's kind of like you versus Aptos as well, right? You're a little bit, right? Yeah, but versus, like, they're kind of like out there, and you're making sure it's right, maybe, and who knows? It's a trade-off.
I mean, it's a really interesting point because, like, I think one of the things that maybe a lot of people watching don't know is that the process of a Web 2 company choosing to build on a blockchain is not a unmediated process, I think I would say. There's often a lot of meetings involved in someone saying, like, we can just hypothetical Web 2 company saying we want to build a rewards NFT system, right, for what we're building. There's going to be a lot of meetings with lots of different potential chains and providers and something like that. And trade-offs that make a network attractive for developers will often make it not attractive for those Web 2 companies because they look at something and they say, well, there's been periods of downtime for this, or an outage, right? And they can say, like, well, for our organization, the PR hit is not worth, even if we think that the technology platform might be better, because we exist in a Web 2 world with Web 2 users, there's a PR trade-off there. So you're exactly right that, like, the process that goes into deciding how scale works is often as much human as it is technical.
I mean, admittedly for us, right, like, we're blessed in a position we're not first, right?
It's great to not be live.
We've been
I will
monitoring
say
what everyone's been doing. We
Yeah.
had a big experience with DM, and then for us in general, we designed a system that is multi-threaded from day one. Our system is multi-threaded. It takes advantage of scale. You add more machines, it's faster, right? Like, the idea that you can have a cap on throughput, and today your fee is $1, and next week it's $5. You can't build a sustainable business model then. Today, you can't tell me I play a game for a cent and I can't play it unless the fees are really low. I think that's the element of cloud that is great that we've adopted with our dedicated proof of stake system.
Totally. But at the same time, when you're running two different consensus models, you've doubled your failure possibility, right? And that's kind of one of these great examples.
Well, you also have greater, for us, right? Like, you have one that's working the other. You have more redundancy, right? Like, it's a system design we've taken that we think actually benefits us in the longer term. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, what's interesting about this is that we're talking about hitting the limits of what's possible, right? So we're all taking a different approach. In order to be able to scale, one thing that I think is really important to remember is we're pioneering a lot of things that nobody else has done before. So whether it be being comfortable with actually having downtime, but hitting that theoretical limit of what you can do, and as you say, it's that trade-off of being comfortable with that, or taking a different approach of maybe taking a little bit of slower approach of making sure that everything is stable. Again, it's that trade-off, but anything that we're doing essentially is really at the forefront of what's possible out there. And I think that's why I'm here, that's what's exciting to me, is that really this is such a nascent field anyways, it doesn't ultimately matter which direction we're going, it's going to benefit the entire space. Because looking back 5 years from now, looking back, a lot of what we've learned as individual projects will now be rolled up into perhaps new projects, or now it'll be stronger. Where we are today is nowhere near where we're going to be. That's really interesting about it.
I would say the voice I wish we had on stage with us is Cosmos. Because Cosmos' approach to scaling is fascinating, and it's been very ahead of a lot of, like, the Cosmos approach to scaling that I think is particularly interesting is that you have many fractured states in application-specific side chains and networks of networks, and you have this theoretical, practical interoperability using IBC and these connectors, but what we've seen is that very few people take use of those connectors. We've seen this too with the L2 and scaling solutions for Ethereum, with Optimism, Arbitrum. They don't have many users, even though they're able to offer things like much lower fees. And so as we kind of get into the end of this and talk a little bit more about that decentralized economy portion of it, are users actually ready for, I don't want to call it decentralization, but fracturization, right?
I think they are. So on our front, so EOS and I guess the underlying, Antelope ecosystem, it was very much decentralized. And so you have multiple blockchains that were running the same software stack, but that very much were competitors and were not talking to each other. In the last 8 months or so, when we created the foundation, one of the big things that we wanted to do was to create those partnerships with those other ecosystems. And so what we saw happen is that these, right now we have 4 partners in there, Wax, Telos, UX, and EOS, that have come together, started deploying funding towards IBC, which we're currently running between chains. So we all had our own separate communities, our own applications, our own ecosystems. We're taking the opposite approach, where now we're creating that interconnectivity in order to scale.
But are you seeing
like
people
completely
use
the
them?
opposite?
Right? Like, the question is, are you seeing people use them?
Yes, because right now that was one of the issues, right? They weren't able to scale further than that, and that is the method that we're using to actually scale. Whereas instead of creating it at the onset, not having a user base and potentially kind of growing too fast in a way, we're having to do that by, not necessarily by choice, in order to scale. It's a very different approach.
What have you found with Starkware? Because you guys have been approaching this problem for a while, and the user side of things is a very interesting problem to solve.
Yeah, so the way we went about it with StarkX is offer this, going back to what we're good at and what so we're not about hype, we're about delivering scale to ones who need it. So luckily, not luckily, we're very fortunate and very proud to have partnered with amazing B2C teams. For instance, Sorare, they have a user base of, I think, upwards of 2 million users that are basically using NFTs. These users don't even know that necessarily these are NFTs or on Ethereum on a layer 2 on StarkX, but they are. Again, it's about delivering scale, not about necessarily the hype around it. Immutable X, with its multiple of amazing teams building on it, has a user base of active users of hundreds of thousands. DYDX, volumes right now already nearing $1 trillion of volume being traded overall. And TPS, there have been weeks where the TPS on StarkX has surpassed that of Ethereum, and on most weeks we surpass Bitcoin, and probably, I'm guessing, 10x all the other L2s combined. So I think, crypto Twitter doesn't necessarily know these facts so much because, as I said, we're not.
But they're still really small numbers, right? At the end of the day,
no, they're huge numbers.
2 million is very small.
2 million active users.
But 2
using
million
NFTs on a game, those are not small numbers. I mean,
no. I mean, at best, we're talking about 30 million users a day signing transactions across the entire user right now.
I don't find those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, you've dealt with some large numbers.
I think, let's be real, right? There aren't enough users in Web3.
Yeah.
It's a small number of users. The use cases are mostly gambling related or DeFi related, right? In my view, DeFi is not a product. It's a building block or a tool, right? I think unfortunately we've led with a lot of that, and it's great. People have made money, people have lost money, but I think the reality is the next cycle we need real applications with real users, with use cases that keeps them engaged and enticed for a very long time. I think there aren't enough users in Web3, which is why we maybe say we don't need the skill solutions now. But when you start talking about gaming, when you have 100 million people playing video games, you need to transfer items in real time. When you're moving assets from AWS to now a public ledger, you're going to need real scaling solutions. And especially if it's not focused around like literally milking the most amount of money out of users, but giving them a new gaming experience that they never had before. That's our goal, and that's our mission. I think it's going beyond the hype we've had so far and bringing in real users. When we talk about 10, 12 million people, it's not a lot of people. We're nowhere near.
Okay, I would like to stick up for us collectively, though, if I may. Well, first of all, every single one of us believes in a multi-chain world, right? And
yes.
You're the head of comms at Solana. How many times have you said, we are not an Ethereum killer, we're not trying to be an Ethereum killer? The same thing with us, right? We all believe in a multi-chain world. That's the first thing. Second thing is traditional finance. I was at JP Morgan in 2015 when we went from T+3 to T+2, and how many years did it take them to do that? And we all gave ourselves a big pat on the back, right?
Yeah.
And then, NASDAQ can do, so many trades per second that we can't even imagine doing an algorithm. But, we don't close from Friday at 4 p.m. until Monday morning. We don't sit around waiting for the opening bell. You know what I mean? So you got to think about, we are really, to your point, we are pushing the envelope of these things. And, this is why I think we all believe in the Web3 proposition more broadly, right?
And this is maybe how it scales, right? So you bring in a really interesting point in terms of multi-chain. What we're seeing in terms of user base, the end user that are coming in, and to your point, we are nowhere near, if you wanted to replicate, so I don't think it was a jab at you, but if we're talking about hundreds of millions of users, we're nowhere near being able to do that, none of us at all, at any given time right now. This idea of multi-chain, that's because inevitably, if you're in a decentralized system, you will not be as efficient as a centralized system. You just cannot be. That is one of the premises, right? But you somewhat can be if you end up being multi-chain. If chains start interconnecting with one another, you might not hit the same amount, you might not be as efficient, and that is the trade-off. But you will bring about other value propositions that currently the current Web 2 cannot provide. And really that's, I guess, what we're all here about anyways.
I just want to say, I gotta say this, look, you know, already 3 years ago, we demonstrated in production, we can process the TPS of 9,000 for trades, 18,000 for payments. We mint regularly millions of NFTs per block for Immutable X. The reason we don't have billions of users using StarkX systems is not because it doesn't scale, it's because the users aren't coming. But the technology
Yes, that was not a comment around technology, that was a comment around just there being so few users.
Yeah.
So, but,
Okay, agreed.
well, our time is up, but thank you all for sticking around on this late afternoon panel here. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Austin.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you, our panel led Avery, Austin, Sierra. Thank you so